The cold was a constant thief. It stole the feeling from Alara's fingers, the warmth from her breath, and the hope from her heart. It seeped through the threadbare wool of her tunic, a damp and gnawing presence that had become as much a part of her as the ache in her bones. The stone floor of the great hall was a sheet of ice beneath her knees, unforgiving and vast. Her hands were raw. Red and chapped, they protested the harsh lye soap and the stiff, bristled brush she worked back and forth, back and forth. The motion was mechanical, a rhythm of misery she had known for 10 years, ever since the fever took her parents and left her an orphan, a burden, an omega shadow in the boisterous Blackwood pack. She was nothing, less than nothing, a ghost who scrubbed floors. A sharp kick connected with her ribs, stealing the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. She curled inward, bracing for another, her cheek pressed against the freezing, wet stone. The scent of pine and expensive perfume filled the air above her, a stark contrast to the acrid smell of the soap. "Still alive down there, rat?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with shards of glass. She was the Alpha's daughter, beautiful and cruel, a princess in a world where Alara was the dirt beneath her embroidered slippers. Alara did not answer. Answering invited more pain. Silence only invited scorn, and scorn was easier to bear than a split lip. She kept her eyes on the swirling gray patterns of the suds on the floor. Lyra laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a graveyard. "Look at it! Utterly pathetic." She nudged Alara aside again with the toe of her boot, harder this time. "Father is hosting the emissaries from the Stonefang Pack tonight. This hall needs to gleam, not look like a drowned rodent has been crawling all over it." A dark liquid splashed across the stones Alara had just finished scrubbing, staining the pale gray a deep, ugly brown. Wine. Lyra had deliberately emptied her goblet onto the floor. The sweet, cloying scent of it mixed with the lye, making Alara's stomach churn. "Oops," Lyra said, her voice devoid of any apology. "Looks like you missed a spot." Her friends, 2 other high-ranking she-wolves, giggled behind her. Their amusement was a physical force, pressing down on Alara, reminding her of her place. Alara remained still, her breath held tight in her chest. Rage, hot and useless, flickered deep within her, a tiny ember in a frozen wasteland. What would it be like to scream? To stand up and throw the bucket of filthy water right into Lyra's perfect, sneering face. The thought was so foreign, so impossible, it was almost laughable. It would be her death. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the fantasy away. It was a dangerous indulgence. Hope was a weapon others used against you. She had learned that long ago. She had to be empty, a vessel for their contempt. That was the only way to survive. "Get it cleaned up," Lyra commanded, her tone bored now that her small act of cruelty was complete. "And try not to leave the stench of your misery behind. It puts people off their food." The trio moved away, their laughter echoing in the cavernous hall. Alara waited until the sound faded completely before she allowed herself to breathe. The air shuddered into her lungs, cold and sharp. The kicked spot on her ribs throbbed with a dull, persistent beat. She pushed herself back up to her knees, the movement a symphony of aches. She dipped her brush into the bucket. The water was frigid, and the new stain was dark. It would take time. More time on her knees. More time with the cold seeping into her marrow. She gritted her teeth, the sound of faint scrape in the silence. She would not cry. She had run out of tears years ago. All that was left was this stubborn, grim refusal to completely break. It was not strength. She knew that. It was just an absence of any other choice. As she scrubbed the wine stain, a strange gust of wind rattled the heavy wooden shutters of the hall. It was a mournful sound, a howl that seemed to come from the bones of the world itself. The fire in the great hearth sputtered, casting dancing, anxious shadows that made the hall seem even larger and emptier. The wind was rising. Everyone had been speaking of it for days. A storm, the elders claimed, the likes of which had not been seen in a century. A ghost blizzard. They said it carried the spirits of the fallen. Alara just thought it meant more cold. Deeper cold. A cold that might finally get all the way inside. She finished the floor as the sky outside turned a bruised, sickly purple, the color of a coming storm. The wind was a living thing now, shrieking around the edges of the fortress, clawing at the stone. She hauled the heavy bucket outside to empty it, and the force of the gale nearly tore it from her grasp. Snow, not in flakes but in a solid, blinding sheet, was already falling. It wasn't snow, it was ice, sharp and stinging against her exposed skin. She scurried back inside, her task done, hoping only to find her small corner in the servants' barracks, a thin blanket, and a few hours of numb, dreamless sleep. But Lyra and her suitor, a brutish alpha named Jorik, were waiting for her by the kitchens. Jorik was large and perpetually angry, his desire for Lyra making him eager to please her in any way he could. That usually meant making Alara's life more difficult. "There's the stray," Jorik grunted, blocking her path. His scent was aggressive, all musk and dominance. It made the hairs on her arms stand up. "The storm is getting worse, Jorik," Lyra said, pulling her fur-lined cloak tighter. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Alara with a chilling glee. "Father said we need to conserve resources. No room for useless mouths. Especially not now." A knot of pure ice formed in Alara's stomach. Useless mouth. That was her. She was a line item in a ledger, a drain on the pack's stores. She tried to step around them, to make herself smaller, to disappear. "Where do you think you're going?" Jorik's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her upper arm like a manacle. The strength in his grip was terrifying. He could snap her bones without a thought. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. "Please," she whispered, the word a frozen puff of air. It was a mistake. Pleading was weakness, and they fed on weakness. "Please what?" Lyra mocked, stepping closer. Her beautiful face was twisted with a vicious excitement. "Please let me stay inside where it's warm? Please let me eat another scrap of bread I haven't earned? The pack has carried you for 10 years, you ungrateful wretch. It's time you were put out." Put out. The words echoed the shrieking of the wind. They meant death. No one could survive this storm. Not out there. Not alone. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind itself, finally pierced through Alara's practiced numbness. "No," she breathed, pulling against Jorik's grip. It was useless. He was a mountain. "No, please, Lyra. I'll do anything. I'll work twice as hard." "It's too late for that," Jorik snarled, and began to drag her toward the postern gate, the small, rarely used exit at the back of the keep. 2 of his followers fell in behind them, their expressions grim and resolute. They were following an order from the Alpha's daughter. They were really doing it. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. They were going to throw her out into the blizzard. The thought was so monstrous, her mind refused to fully grasp it. This was not a beating or a humiliation. This was an execution. Her struggling became frantic. She kicked and twisted, her worn boots finding no purchase on the slick stones. "Please, don't do this!" Her voice was thin and reedy against the roar of the storm that now consumed the world. Lyra laughed. It was the last thing Alara heard clearly before the heavy wooden gate was unbarred. A wall of white, a maelstrom of ice and wind exploded into the corridor. It was a physical assault, blinding her, choking her. Jorek shoved her forward, hard. She stumbled out of the relative shelter of the keep and into the full, unrestrained fury of the blizzard. She fell to her knees in the rapidly deepening snow, the cold instantly, shockingly absolute. It was like being plunged into a frozen ocean. A fitting end for a worthless Omega. Lyra's voice, faint and carried away by the gale, shouted from the gate. "Consider this a mercy." Then the gate slammed shut. The heavy thud of the bar falling into place was the sound of her world ending. She was alone. The wind was a solid wall, pushing her, tearing at her. The snow wasn't falling. It was moving horizontally, a torrent of tiny, sharp knives that scoured her skin. Within seconds, her thin tunic was soaked, and the cold was no longer on her skin, but in her blood, in her bones. She tried to stand. The wind knocked her down again. Panic gave way to a primal, desperate need to move, to find shelter, any shelter. The keep was behind her, an impassable mountain of stone and cruelty. Ahead was only the forest that marked the edge of the Blackwood territory. And beyond that, nothing. The borderlands. Unclaimed territory ruled by winter and predators. She crawled at first, then managed to get to her feet, leaning into the wind as if it were a physical opponent. She couldn't see more than a foot in front of her. The world was a swirling vortex of white and gray. Every breath was an agony, sucking ice-cold air into her burning lungs. Was this happening? Was she really dying out here? She didn't know how long she stumbled, minutes or hours. Time had dissolved into a repeating cycle of falling and rising, of pushing forward into a white, roaring void. Her limbs grew heavy, numb. The shivering that had racked her body began to subside, replaced by a strange, creeping lethargy. She knew, in some distant part of her mind, that this was a bad sign. This was the cold winning. She tripped over a fallen log buried in the snow and went down hard. This time, she didn't have the strength to get up. The snow was soft, almost welcoming, a bed of white. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to just sleep. The pain was fading, the cold was fading. Everything was fading into a quiet, peaceful gray. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. This is the end. No more scrubbing, no more kicks, no more hunger, just quiet. A tear froze on her cheek, a tiny diamond of sorrow. Through the roaring of the wind, another sound penetrated her fading consciousness. A low growl. It was deep, guttural, vibrating through the ground. Fear, a final faint instinct, flickered. A wolf. A winter wolf, starved and desperate in the storm. Of course. She was not even allowed to die in peace. She was to be food. She forced her heavy eyelids open. A shape was materializing out of the white chaos. It was massive, far larger than any wolf she had ever seen. Its fur was the color of shadow and silver, dusted with snow. It moved with a predatory grace that was both beautiful and utterly terrifying. But it was the eyes that held her. They glowed with a faint internal light, the color of amber in a fire. The great wolf stopped a few feet from her, its head low. It watched her, its gaze intense, intelligent. It wasn't the mindless hunger of a beast she saw there, but something else, something ancient and assessing. The wind whipped its fur, but the creature stood as if rooted to the earth, a being of immense power and stillness in the heart of the storm. It took another step closer, lowering its head to her face. Its breath was a plume of steam in the frigid air, smelling not of blood and raw meat, but of pine and winter storms and something else, something elemental and clean. Alara's heart gave a final, panicked flutter. She was too weak to move, to even flinch away. She could only lie there, waiting for the teeth to close on her throat. But the teeth never came. Instead, a strange shimmering began to distort the air around the wolf. The clear, sharp lines of its form blurred, swirling like smoke. Bones cracked and reformed with sounds that were swallowed by the gale. The massive lupine shape folded in on itself, shrinking and stretching, until a man knelt where the beast had been. He was as large and formidable as his other form. Naked to the waist despite the impossible cold, his skin seemed to radiate a faint heat. Broad shoulders tapered to a narrow waist, every inch of him corded with lean, powerful muscle. His hair was long and black as a raven's wing, plastered to his head and shoulders with melting snow. But it was his face that stole the last of her breath. It was a face of harsh, predatory beauty, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, as if carved from mountain granite. And his eyes, they were the same as the wolf's. Molten amber, glowing with an inner fire that seemed to hold back the storm itself. He was looking at her with that same unnerving intensity, a gaze that felt like it was peeling back the layers of her miserable existence and seeing the raw, shivering soul beneath. Who was he? What was he? He reached a hand toward her, his fingers long and calloused. She flinched, a pathetic, reflexive motion. She expected a blow, a shove, contempt. But his hand stopped, hovering just above her cheek. He was so close she could feel the heat rolling off his skin, a stark, shocking contrast to the lethal cold that had claimed her. It felt like standing near a furnace. "You are freezing," he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble that vibrated in her chest like distant thunder. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with an authority that expected no argument. He had to be from one of the northern clans. They were wilder, more powerful, rumored to be more wolf than man. A king, perhaps, judging by the sheer, untamed power that clung to him like a cloak. The Alpha King. The legends whispered his name, Kale, a being ancient and terrible and absolute. The stories said he had been searching for something for centuries. Alara could not speak. Her lips were numb, her jaw frozen. She could only stare, her mind struggling to comprehend the impossible reality of him. A monster from the storm, a king from a legend, kneeling over her as she lay dying. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her face, then lower. He seemed to be looking for something. His expression was a mask of stern concentration. Then, gently, so gently it was almost an apology, his fingers brushed against the frozen skin of her neck, seeking a pulse. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It was not a sound, it was a feeling. A cataclysm. Searing, blinding heat shot from the point of contact, a bolt of lightning that struck the core of her being. It was not the gentle warmth from before. It was a fire, an inferno. It ripped through her frozen limbs, burning away the numbness, the cold, the creeping death. It was agony and ecstasy, 1,000 suns erupting behind her eyes. A silent scream tore from her soul. The world went white, not with snow, but with pure, incandescent light. A brand, hotter than any forge, pressed itself against her skin. She felt a phantom pain, a searing line being drawn on the back of her right hand, and the smell of ozone and burning magic filled the air. Through the blinding light, she saw his eyes. They were no longer amber. They were blazing gold, molten and brilliant, wide with shock and a dawning, terrible awe. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned, but it was too late. The connection had been made. A cord of light, visible only to them, now stretched between his heart and hers, a living, vibrant thing. The world rushed back in, the roar of the blizzard a distant whisper compared to the roaring in her own blood. The heat remained, a bonfire lit within her, pushing back the cold, making her skin tingle and her heart hammer against her ribs with a strength it hadn't had in years. She could feel her fingers and toes again, a pins and needles sensation that was excruciating but blessedly real. She was alive, more alive than she had ever been. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her movements clumsy but her own. She stared at the back of her right hand. There, stark against her pale, cold reddened skin, was a mark. It was intricate and silver, glowing with a soft internal luminescence, a perfect, slender crescent moon, and nestled in its curve was a single, tiny, 5-pointed star. It looked like it had been tattooed there with liquid starlight. It pulsed with a gentle warmth that matched the new, frantic rhythm of her heart. What was happening to me? The question was a terrified shriek in her mind. This was magic. Dark magic. She had been raised to fear such things. This was a curse. She looked up at the man, Kale. He was staring at her, at the mark, his harsh face a canvas of disbelief, reverence, and something else. Something fiercely, terrifyingly possessive. The golden light in his eyes softened, but the intensity remained. It was the look of a starving man finding a feast, the look of a king finding his crown. He moved slowly, as if afraid of startling a wild animal. He knelt before her again, the snow melting in a circle around him from the sheer heat of his body. He reached out, not to touch her, but to hover his hand over the glowing mark. He could feel it. She knew he could. She could feel him too. An awareness of him had bloomed in her senses, a deep, resonant hum at the base of her skull. She knew his name was Kale without being told. She knew he was ancient. She knew he was overwhelmingly, devastatingly alone. "You," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was 100 years of searching, 1,000 years of solitude packed into a single word. He finally looked from the mark to her face, his golden eyes locking with hers. "It's you." Fear, sharp and absolute, cut through her confusion. This was too much. The storm, the abandonment, the magic, this man. He was too big, too powerful. His gaze was too intense. He looked at her like she was precious. No one had ever looked at her like that. It felt more dangerous than any blow. "Mine," he breathed, the word a soft, absolute declaration. It was not a question of ownership, but a statement of cosmic fact, a recognition. Alara scrambled backward, crab-walking through the snow, trying to put distance between them. The movement was a mistake. A sharp, tearing pain ripped through her chest, centered on the new bond between them. It felt like her soul was being stretched to its breaking point. She cried out, clutching her chest. He winced, a mirror of her own pain flashing across his face. "Do not," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "Do not pull away. It will hurt us both." He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of peace that was completely at odds with the raw power he radiated. Hurt us both? What did that mean? What was this thing that connected them? She stared at him, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. Her instincts, the deep, primal part of her that had been sleeping for a decade, were screaming at her. But they weren't screaming in fear of him. They were screaming in recognition. A deep, cellular hum inside her was drawn to him, wanted to be closer to the furnace of his strength, to the safety he represented. Her mind, however, was terrified. This was a predator of the highest order, a king, and she was nothing. A scrub girl left to die in the snow. "I have you," he said softly, as if soothing a frightened foal. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion. "The storm is too strong. We need shelter." He held out a hand to her. It was an invitation, not a command. She stared at his outstretched hand, at the calloused palm and long, strong fingers. The same hand that had touched her and branded her soul. The same hand that had saved her from freezing. Hope, that treacherous, dangerous thing, unfurled a tiny, fragile leaf in her chest. A new life? A new home? Could it be possible? Or was this just a different kind of cage? Hesitantly, her body acting before her mind could protest, she placed her trembling, marked hand in his. The moment their skin met again, the warmth flared, comfortable this time, a deep and reassuring heat that flowed up her arm and settled in her chest. The tearing pain vanished, replaced by a profound sense of rightness, of peace. His fingers closed around hers, enveloping her small hand completely. His grip was firm, protective, absolute. He led her through the blinding chaos of the blizzard as if it were a calm summer's day. The wind still howled, but it seemed to part around him, to respect the sphere of his power. He moved with unerring certainty to a place she never would have found, a fissure in a rock face hidden by ancient, snow-laden pines. It was the entrance to a small cave, a den. Inside, the roar of the storm muted to a distant moan. It was dark, but a faint, silvery light emanated from the mark on her hand, and an even stronger golden light from his eyes, illuminating the small space. He released her hand to push a loose boulder partially over the entrance, securing them from the worst of the wind. The sudden separation was a physical pang, a brief, sharp sense of loss that startled her. "Sit," he commanded softly, gesturing to the driest part of the cave floor. He stripped off his own fur-lined cloak, the one he must have been wearing before he shifted, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was huge, heavy, and smelled of him, pine, snow, and that clean, masculine scent. It was still warm from his body. The luxury of it, the simple act of kindness, was so overwhelming that tears pricked her eyes. She sank to the ground, pulling the enormous cloak around her, a pathetic, shivering bundle. He sat across from her, not close enough to be threatening, but not far enough for the bond to cause pain. He just watched her, his golden eyes unblinking in the dark. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. What was that?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a raw whisper. "The mark?" "It is a soul bond," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "The sign of a fated mate. I have been searching for you for over 300 years. 300 years. The number was incomprehensible. Fated mate. The words meant nothing to her. Such things were for alphas, for the beautiful and the strong, not for her. "You're mistaken," she whispered, shaking her head. The movement was stiff. "I'm no one. I'm an omega, a cast-off." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She was telling him the truth, warning him off. A king could not be mated to a nothing. His expression hardened. A dangerous light flared in his golden eyes. "Who did this to you?" he growled, the sound vibrating through the small cave. "Who cast you out?" The fury in his voice was terrifying. It was a promise of retribution, of violence. It was on her behalf. The thought was so alien, it made her dizzy. "My pack," she stammered. "The Blackwoods." "They will pay," he said. It was not a threat. It was a vow, a sentence passed. "They left you to die. They left my mate to die." He said the word mate with a reverence that made her flinch. "I'm not," she started, but her protest died in her throat. How could she deny the glowing mark on her hand? How could she deny the humming connection that vibrated between them, a tangible presence in the air? How could she deny the fact that she was alive only because he had found her? A sliver of hope, desperate and foolish, began to worm its way into her heart. Maybe this was real. Maybe she wasn't worthless. Maybe her life was not over. Maybe, just maybe, it was about to begin. She looked at him, the Alpha King, her mate, and for the first time in a decade, she felt something other than fear and despair. She felt a terrifying, overwhelming, impossible flicker of hope. They spent the rest of the night in the den as the blizzard raged. Cale did not press her. He gave her space, watching over her as she drifted into an exhausted, fitful sleep, wrapped in the warmth of his cloak and the even greater warmth of the bond. For the first time she could remember, she did not feel cold. But outside, in the storm, they had been seen. Jorik had not returned to the keep immediately. Driven by a possessive, spiteful jealousy, he had lingered near the gate, expecting to hear Alara's screams, a final, satisfying proof of her demise. When none came, a sour suspicion had taken root. He had followed her tracks, shielded from the worst of the storm by his alpha strength and thick furs. He had followed them to the border. He saw it all from a ridge overlooking the pine grove. He saw the massive dark wolf. He saw it shift into a man whose power was a palpable aura even from a distance. He saw the flash of light, the impossible moment of connection, and through a gap in the rocks, as he crept closer, he saw the glowing silver mark on the Omega's hand. He knew the legends, every shifter did. The Alpha King of the North, Cale, was ancient and unmatched, but he was incomplete. He had spent centuries searching for his fated mate, the other half of his soul. Finding her would double his power, solidify his reign for another millennium, and this worthless, sniveling Omega was her. A vicious, greedy thought took root in Jorik's mind. Lyra had wanted her dead, but dead, she was useless. Alive. Alive, she was a key to unimaginable power. He knew of those who would pay any price for such a key. The Ember Covenant, a shadowy cult of shifters who practiced forbidden blood magic, led by a rival king who called himself Malachor, the Shadow of the North. Malachor's singular ambition was to overthrow Cale and seize his throne, to deliver Cale's fated mate into his hands. Jorik would be made a lord. He would have more power than Lyra's father. He could have Lyra herself, or 100 like her. Greed burned away all other thoughts. He backed away from the den, his movements silent and quick. He had to get back. He had to gather his men before the king emerged with his new prize. The Omega was his ticket to glory. Alara awoke to a strange sense of unease. The bond was a placid river in her soul, but on its surface there were anxious ripples. Cale was already awake, standing near the entrance, his body tense. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still rough from sleep. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low. "I scented something on the wind. Trespassers. I will deal with it." The promise of violence in his tone was unmistakable. He was a king protecting his territory, protecting her. He glanced back at her, his golden eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "I will not be long." Then he was gone, slipping out of the den and into the pre-dawn gloom. The storm had lessened, but the world was still a canvas of gray and white. The moment he was out of sight, the bond stretched, a familiar, unpleasant ache starting in her chest. It was a constant reminder of his presence, and now, his absence. She waited, her anxiety growing with every passing second. The unease was turning into a sharp, insistent dread. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The sound came from behind her, a scrape of rock. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. A section of the cave wall she had thought was solid was being pushed inward. It was a hidden entrance. Jorek stepped through the opening, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. Behind him were 3 other alphas from the Blackwood pack, their faces hard and merciless. They held thick, heavy chains in their hands. The chains gleamed with a sickening, pale light. Silver. "Well, well," Jorek sneered, his eyes falling to the glowing mark on her hand. "Look what the storm blew in, a little lost rat, all marked up like a prize pig." Alara scrambled back, pressing herself against the far wall of the cave. "Jorek, what are you doing?" "Securing my future," he said, advancing on her. "Did you really think you could have him? The king? A pathetic thing like you? You are not a person, Alara. You are a tool, and I'm going to use you." He lunged. She tried to dodge, but the cave was too small. His men were on her in an instant, their weight crushing her. A hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. Another grabbed her right arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. Then the silver touched her skin. The pain was unlike anything she had ever known. It was not the clean heat of the bond, but a vile, corrosive fire. It didn't just burn her skin, it burned her soul. The magic of the bond shrieked, the silver acting as a poison, a metaphysical acid that sought to dissolve the connection to Cale. The mark on her hand flickered violently, then dimmed to a dull, aching gray. Through the bond, she felt a distant, psychic roar of pure agony and fury. Cale. He felt it too. He knew. The silver chains were wrapped around her wrists and ankles, each point of contact a source of excruciating, draining torment. Her newfound strength evaporated, leaving her weak and trembling, weaker than she had ever been before. The world swam in a gray haze of pain. "He knows," one of Jorek's men said, his voice nervous. "He'll come for her." "Let him," Jorek snarled, hauling Alara to her feet. She sagged against him, unable to support her own weight. "By the time he finds us, she'll belong to a new master." They dragged her out through the secret tunnel, into the cold, gray morning. The pain of the silver was a constant, agonizing thrum, but beneath it was a deeper, more profound agony. The feeling of the bond being stretched, frayed, and poisoned. It felt like her very soul was being torn in two. Every step they took away from Cale was another twist of the knife. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. Her brief, fragile hope had been a lie. She was not a queen. She was a tool, a prisoner, and her king was not coming for her. The journey was a blur of misery. Jorik and his men pushed her relentlessly, traveling through hidden paths and ancient, forgotten tunnels that burrowed beneath the mountains. The silver chains chafed her wrists raw, and the cold was once again her constant companion, no longer held at bay by the warmth of the bond. The connection to Kale was a thin, frayed thread, a phantom limb that ached with a terrifying emptiness. He was out there, she knew, hunting, raging, but the world was vast, and her captors were cunning. They finally emerged into a vast subterranean cavern, lit by the sickly green glow of phosphorescent moss. In the center of the cavern, a fortress of black volcanic rock had been erected, a jagged scar in the belly of the earth. This was the heart of the Ember Covenant. Men and women in dark robes moved through the fortress with silent purpose. Their faces were pale, their eyes holding a fanatic's gleam. They all turned to stare as Jorik dragged her forward, their gazes lingering on the dull gray mark on her hand. They knew what she was. They looked at her with a mixture of hunger and reverence, as if she were a holy sacrifice. Jorik took her to the throne room, a cavernous hall dominated by a throne carved from a single, massive piece of obsidian. On the throne sat a man who was Kale's opposite in every way. Where Kale was raw, elemental power, this man was shadow and artifice. He was slender and elegant, with pale skin and silver hair that fell to his shoulders. His eyes were the color of chips of ice, and his smile was a thin, cruel line. This was Malachor, the Shadow King. "Jorik," Malachor said, his voice a silken whisper that slid over the skin like a cold snake. "You have succeeded. You have brought me the key." "As promised, Lord Malachor," Jorik said, bowing low and shoving Alara to her knees before the throne. "The Alpha King's mate." Malachor rose and descended the steps, circling Alara like a vulture. He reached out a long, pale finger and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was frigid, draining. "So this is the creature who has haunted Kale's dreams for centuries. I must admit, I am disappointed." He let her go, wiping his finger on his dark robes as if he had touched something unclean. "She is nothing," he mused, his icy eyes dissecting her. "A frightened little mouse. And yet, the fates have chosen her to be the vessel of Kale's heart. How droll." He laughed, a dry, rustling sound. "No matter. Her weakness is her greatest asset, to me." He turned his attention back to Jorik. "You have done well. Your reward will be granted once the ritual is complete." Jorik bowed again, his face alight with greedy triumph, and backed away, leaving Alara alone with the Shadow King. "Do you know what you are, little mouse?" Malachor asked, beginning to pace. "You are a battery, a conduit. This bond you share with Kale, it is a river of power. His power. For centuries he has been a dam, holding it all back. But with you, the floodgates are open. His strength is tied to yours, his soul anchored in your flesh." He stopped in front of her, a predatory excitement in his cold eyes. "I have developed a ritual, a rather ingenious piece of blood magic. We will not simply break the bond, oh no, that is far too crude. We will transfer it. We will sever your connection to Kale and attach it to me. His power, his life force will flow not to you, but to me. It will cripple him, leave him a hollow shell, and it will make me a god." Alara stared at him, horror choking her. He wanted to use her to destroy Kale, to drain him dry. The thought was more painful than the silver that bit into her wrists. The frayed thread of the bond pulsed with a wave of Kale's desperate fury, and a new feeling. Fear. He was afraid. For her. "And what of you?" Malachor continued, as if sensing her thoughts. "Once the transfer is complete, your purpose is served. Your own latent life force, and you do have a surprising amount of it, a little spark hidden under all this misery, will be the final catalyst. It will burn you out like a candle flame. A worthy sacrifice for my ascension. Would you not agree?" He smiled, a humorless baring of teeth. "Take her to the ritual chamber. Chain her to the altar. The eclipse begins in 1 hour, and with it, a new age." 2 robed figures hauled her from the throne room, their grips impersonal and strong. They dragged her down a long, winding corridor to a circular chamber. In the center of the room was a flat, cold slab of rock, the altar. Dark, sinister runes were carved all over the floor and walls, pulsing with a faint, malevolent red light. They chained her to the altar, her arms and legs spread-eagled. The chains were not silver, but cold iron, though it did little to lessen her misery. The despair was a physical weight, crushing her. She was going to die here. Worse, she was going to be the weapon that killed the only person who had ever looked at her and seen someone of worth. The hope she had felt in the cave seemed like a cruel joke, a brief, warm dream before this endless, cold nightmare. Tears she thought had long dried up began to trace paths down her dirty cheeks. She was so tired of being a victim, so tired of being powerless. She closed her eyes, her spirit sinking to its lowest ebb. It was over. "Hold on." The voice was not spoken. It was a thought, a feeling, a raw command blasted through the damaged, aching bond. It was Kale. He was so far, yet he was right there, inside her head, his presence a desperate, blazing fire against the encroaching darkness. "Alara, hold on." She focused on his voice, on the feeling of him, clinging to it like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. Hope, battered and nearly extinguished, flickered once more. "I am coming." His mental voice was a vow, a promise of utter devastation. "I am coming for you." The red runes on the floor began to glow brighter. Malachor entered the chamber, flanked by his acolytes. He held a black, jagged dagger, its blade seeming to drink the light from the room. The ritual was about to begin. "Let us begin," Malachor announced, his voice echoing in the chamber. He raised the dagger. At that exact moment, the entire fortress shook with a cataclysmic impact. A section of the chamber's far wall exploded inward in a shower of rock and dust. A sound, not a howl, but a roar of pure, undiluted fury echoed from the breach. A sound of a king come to reclaim his queen and destroy everything in his path. Through the dust and chaos, a figure emerged. It was Kale. But not the controlled, watchful Kale she had met in the storm. This was a primal force of nature unleashed. His eyes were not gold. They were blazing infernos of silver fire. His teeth were bared in a snarl that was more wolf than man. He had shifted halfway, his hands tipped with black claws, his face a mask of predatory rage. Behind him, his royal guard, massive warriors in their own half-shifted forms, poured into the cavern, their howls joining his. The battle was instant and brutal. Kale's warriors, fueled by their alpha's rage, crashed into the ranks of the Ember Covenant. the cavern filled with the sounds of snarling, the clash of claws on steel, and the screams of the dying. Cale had only one target. He moved through the battle like a phantom of death, a black and silver blur of claws and fury, cutting a straight, bloody path toward the altar, toward her. Malicor's face was a mask of fury. His plan was ruined. "Kill him!" he shrieked at his acolytes, but they were being torn apart by the royal guard. He turned his cold, reptilian eyes on Alara. If he could not have the bond, he would destroy the vessel. He lunged toward the altar, the black dagger raised, aiming for her heart. "If I cannot have you, he will not either," he screamed. Alara saw him coming. She saw Cale fighting desperately, carving his way through 3 of Malicor's personal guard to get to her. He was so close, but he was not going to make it in time. She saw the tip of the dagger descending, and something inside her snapped. It was the image of Cale's frantic eyes. It was the echo of Malicor's voice calling her a worthless vessel. It was a decade of abuse, of being kicked and starved and told she was nothing. It was the memory of the cold and the brief, beautiful warmth of the bond. A lifetime of suppressed pain, fear, and rage ignited with the new, fierce, protective love she felt for the king who was fighting for her. No. The word was not spoken. It was a psychic detonation. It was the final, defiant roar of a soul that would not be broken. And her power, the hidden, dormant spark that Malicor had sensed, the power of a life-bringer, a soul healer, the power of a hidden queen, answered her call. It did not trickle out. It exploded. A wave of pure, blinding white light erupted from her body. It was not hot, but it was intensely, overwhelmingly powerful. It was the light of a newborn star, the essence of life itself. The dark runes on the floor vaporized. The cold iron chains holding her to the altar turned to dust. The wave of light slammed into Malicor, and he screamed, not in pain, but in terror, as the pure living energy scoured his dark magic, unraveling it, destroying it. He was thrown backward, tumbling across the stone floor like a broken doll, his skin smoking where the light had touched him. The light washed over the cavern. It did not harm Cale or his warriors. Instead, it washed over them like a healing balm. Wounds closed, strength returned. It felt like standing in the first light of dawn, but for the members of the Ember Covenant, it was poison. They shrieked as the light burned away their dark enchantments, leaving them weakened and exposed. Alara sat up on the altar, no longer a victim. She was incandescent. The light coalesced around her, clothing her in an aura of power. The mark on her hand blazed with a silver-white fire that outshone everything in the room. Her timidness was burned away, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. She felt the power thrumming in her veins, a wild, beautiful song. She was not worthless. She was power. She slid off the altar, her bare feet silent on the stone. The light in her right hand solidified, forming a long, slender blade of pure, solidified starlight. She looked across the now quiet room at Malicor, who was struggling to rise, his body racked with tremors. "I am not a vessel," she said, and her voice did not whisper. It rang with the clarity of a silver bell, filled with an authority she had never known. It was the voice of a queen. "I am not a tool, and I am not worthless." Cale had stopped, his battle fury replaced by sheer, stunned awe. He stared at her, at the magnificent, terrible power she wielded, at the queen who had risen from the ashes of the Omega. She walked toward Malicor. Cale moved to her side, a dark and deadly shadow next to her radiant light. They stood together, two halves of a whole, king and queen, darkness and light. Malachor looked up at them, at the furious Alpha King and the glowing goddess his victim had become. He saw his end. With a final, desperate snarl, he lunged, not at Alara, but at Kale. Alara moved faster than thought. She stepped in front of Kale, a protective, instinctive motion, and swung the blade of light. It connected with the Shadow King, and with a final, soul-shattering scream, Malachor dissolved into a cloud of black dust and dying embers, his evil obliterated by the pure life force he had sought to steal. Silence descended on the cavern. The battle was over. The Ember Covenant was broken. The blade of light in Alara's hand dissolved back into a gentle glow. The overwhelming aura of power receded, leaving her standing in the center of the ruined chamber, trembling slightly from the aftermath of its release. She looked at her hands, at the mark that now shone with a steady, brilliant light. What had she done? Kale moved, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his hard, warm body, burying his face in her hair. He held her not like she was fragile, but like she was his anchor, the only real thing in the world. His entire body shuddered with relief. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I have you." She sagged against him, the last of her strength leaving her. He held her up, his arms a cage of absolute safety. She pressed her face into his chest, inhaling his scent, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. She was home. This was home. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His eyes, now a soft, molten gold, searched hers. There was no fear in his gaze, only wonder, reverence, and a love so profound it stole her breath. "My queen," he breathed, the words a prayer. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of fierce, desperate tenderness. It was a promise, a vow. It was the sealing of a fate written in the stars. When he finally pulled away, he took her right hand, his thumb stroking the glowing silver mark. "You were never worthless," he said, his voice raw. "They were simply blind. They could not see the sun for its brightness." Tears of gratitude, of release, of overwhelming love streamed down her face. She had spent her life invisible, and this man, this king, saw her more clearly than anyone. He saw her power, her strength, her soul. With a newfound confidence, a certainty that bloomed from the core of her being, she took his larger, calloused hand and placed it over his heart. Then, she covered his hand with her own, the mark on her skin pressing against his knuckles. "Yours," she whispered, and this time, the word was not a question or a surrender. It was a claim, her claim. She was choosing him, just as he had chosen her. A jolt of power, warm and golden, shot from her mark, through his hand and into his chest. He gasped, his back arching as a new mark burned itself into existence on his skin, directly over his heart. When she pulled her hand away, they could both see it. A radiant golden sun, its rays encircling the perfect silver crescent moon and star that matched her own. The bond was complete, whole, sealed not by fate alone, but by a choice made by 2 equal souls. He was hers, as she was his. He looked down at the mark on his chest, then back at her, his golden eyes shining with unshed tears. He touched the new sun on his skin with a sense of wonder. "Mine," he whispered, then corrected himself, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his harsh face. "Ours." Kael brought her back to his kingdom in the north, a vast, beautiful land of silver mountains and dark green forests. He did not hide her away. He brought her before his entire court, the assembled alphas and elders of the northern packs, in the great hall of his mountain citadel. He stood before them, his hand holding hers, their completed bond marks visible for all to see. "For centuries, our pack has been strong, but incomplete," Kael announced, his voice ringing with power and pride. "Today, we are made whole. This is Alara, my mate, my heart. She is the light bringer, the soul healer who shattered the shadow of the Ember Covenant." He turned to her, his gaze soft and full of love. "She is your queen." He squeezed her hand, and together they faced the crowd. A moment of stunned silence, and then, as one, every wolf in the hall, from the mightiest alpha to the youngest pup, dropped to one knee. They bowed not just to their king, but to her power, to her light. Alara looked out at the sea of bowing heads, at the respect and awe on their faces. The girl who had scrubbed floors while being kicked and mocked was gone. The Omega who had been left to die in the snow was a ghost. In her place stood a queen, beloved and powerful, her hand held securely in that of her king. She felt the warmth of his hand, the steady, unbreakable strength of the bond in her soul, and the deep, profound peace of finally, truly being home. The cold was gone forever. Here, in the heart of the north, with her mate by her side, she would only ever know warmth.